Richardson, in Practical Presentation Pearls, Evidence-Based Recommendations from Psychology and Physiology Literature. I'll be presenting this on behalf of myself and my co-authors in this project. And sadly, no one has tried to buy our souls in creating this presentation. Now, if you ask your colleagues about their opinions on the best way to give a presentation, you will get many opinions. And that's what, unfortunately, they are, mostly opinions. Everybody's got lots and lots of them. What if you took away all the opinions? Would there be anything of actual evidence-based stuff left behind? So we tried our best to extirpate all opinions and base things on the actual physiologic and psychological literature. And we put that together in this paper we published recently in Academic Radiology. Now, I'm happy to report that over the last maybe 60, 70, 80 years, psychology has moved from a realm of mostly subjective experiments, where you rely on what the subject tells you, moved instead to a realm of objective experiments, where using tools such as these, we can actually see what's going on inside the brains of the subjects while they're learning stuff. It's been pretty exciting. One of the more exciting things I read recently was an article from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, where they hooked up a functional MRI machine, another one to a listener. And while the presenter was giving a presentation, his brain started pulsing in certain areas. And the experimenters were delighted to find that once the listener started getting into it and really responding to the presentation, the listener's brain started pulsing in exactly the same areas. I find this endlessly fascinating. I have no idea how to harness it around presentations, but maybe someday we will. In the meantime, I'm going to stick to these 4 areas, starting with cognitive biases. Cognitive bias is something that enhances or impairs recall of memory. In Wikipedia, they list about 50 of these. I will not list all of those today, but just concentrate on these 3. Start with the serial position bias. Basically, this bias says that things that are presented first and last are remembered the best out of a series of. So here's a curve in which here we have the number of facts along this axis. Here we have the likelihood that the listener will actually remember them. This is a curve that's plotted for 25 facts, sort of a very fact-filled presentation. Notice which ones are going to be remembered the best, first and the end. What if we cut that down to just maybe 5 facts? Notice some big improvement already, that more and more of the information is being remembered. What if we cut it down to just 3 facts? Looks like now almost everything will be remembered. So the old adage about limit yourself to a few good points has a really strong basis in experimental psychology. I think you can also see why I put this particular technique first, because I really want you to remember it. The next cognitive bias, levels of processing effect. Turns out when you think harder about something, that blood flow to your parts of your brain goes up, and when that happens, you tend to remember them better. So experimenters have shown that if you throw a list of items to a subject, then later ask them to recall what they saw, they do pretty well. But if you ask them to add a little deeper processing, such as you go through this list, decide which ones are living and which ones are non-living. If you do that, then they tend to remember the list a whole lot better. Extend this to, say, a lecture on MSK radiology that I'm giving, where I throw out the following concepts. Suppose instead of just throwing out a list of concepts, I ask you to think, which one of these are associated with Paget's disease? Chances are you'll remember the stuff a lot better. One final cognitive bias, curiosity effect. The idea is that when people are curious about something, they tend to learn better. You can actually see this happening in different areas of the brain, like the hippocampus firing when someone is curious about the topic they're listening to. How can we harness this? Well, I suppose the best way, the good way, the true way would be to learn our audience. Learn each one of your students, learn what they like, what they don't like, what they want to be when they grow up. But sometimes you can't do that for a whole audience, maybe sometimes hundreds of people. We could go to the dark side and rely on radiology clickbait, things like the RSNA does not want you to see this next slide. Fix your boards with this one weird trick. Now, if your audience will see right through that stuff. So what you could do, I suppose, if you cannot really find a way to connect with them, you can rely on pejorative things such as their inherent dread of radiology board exam coming up, or their dread of being sued someday for something they say. But hopefully you'll find a path to light and find out what actually intrigues them and harness the curiosity effect for that. Next, I want to spend some time talking about visual and auditory channels, then later on how they interact. So here's this idea called dual channel. You learn basically through two channels. Through your eyes, you see stuff. Through your ear, you hear stuff. And somehow your brain takes all this information in and, well, let's talk about some visual channel effects, starting with one that is made to order for diagnostic radiologists, the picture superiority bias. This would be the educational psychologist version of this old adage, a picture's worth 1,000 words. When you look at what's actually going on in the brain when people learn, you find that pictures and words are encoded in different parts of the brain. It turns out that pictures have a huge processing advantage over words. So rather than showing slides like this, where they're heavy on the words and a small, miserable image, dude, you're a radiologist. Blow the picture up, fill the screen, show your audience something that they will process much more efficiently. You can tell a few stories about it, but mostly rely on the picture to do the teaching. Next concept is color vision deficiency. When you put your talk together, do you consider that, at least in North America, 8% of the men in your audience and almost 1% of the women in your audience won't be able to see this green number in the middle of this somewhat red background pattern? That has some implications for your studies. Another example is suppose you're talking to an audience of 25 women, 25 men. Chances are almost 90% that one person in your audience will not be able to tell the difference between red and green items on your figures. Let me put it yet another way. You submit your paper to a journal, has 3 male North American reviewers. Chances are almost 1 in 4 that one of them won't be able to understand what your diagrams are saying. For example, this one, if you're relying on that red dot for radionuclide, a story about why it's so much different from those green dots for the other imaging modalities, it's just not going to work. What your audience will, what your subjects with color vision deficiency will see is something that looks a little more like. So, how do you optimize your presentation colors? Here is a wonderful app. It's free for Mac, for PC, for Linux. And what this allows you to do is scan through your slide deck and quickly see, the top slide's not going to work. I've got to fix that. Lower one, okay, colors are not what I would have chosen, but they all look different. Also, you could prospectively try to pick a safe color palette. If you look at the column on the left, this is what someone with normal color vision might see. And these particular colors have been carefully chosen so they all look different enough to people with all different varieties of color vision deficiency. In our original article, we published this really geeky table here of actual numbers you can dial in to get these exact same colors in your presentation if you desire. Here's another technique that is really, really handy. It's called the redundant coding of information. This slide right here, every one of these lines looks exactly the same except for color. So even someone who can see the difference between red and green is going to have to look up to the upper left-hand corner and go back and forth from the charts to that little legend to figure out what the heck is going on here. And if you happen to be one of those people with color vision deficiency, they all look the same. Instead, what if you encoded your information like this? Every line now looks different. Every dot on page looks different. I've moved the labels down right next to the line so it's easier to tell which ones are which. redundant coding of information several different ways makes it much easier for a mixed audience to tell what you're talking about. And there's a benefit. Suppose you print this out on a black and white printer, or you make a photocopy of it. All this information is still going to be legible if you use this technique. All right, let me now talk about visual embellishments. I could have had just a plain vanilla bar chart right here, but no, I put together these little glossy packages to get my point across. These are called visual embellishments. They're little extra bits of icing that don't really convey anything. There's a very persuasive book by Dr. Edward Tufte on the visual display of quantitative information. He has the idea that visual embellishments are the spawn of Satan. You should not use them. Every time you use one, you distract your audience. He calls this chart junk, suggests you don't use it. However, after following his work, other people have looked into this and found that, you choose them carefully, visual embellishments actually can be pretty persuasive. There is a price to pay. If you throw a complex embellishment at, it takes a while for the audience to process it. But if you choose wisely, it will make them remember it better. So the suggestion would be, if you use these, use just 2 or 3 sprinkled throughout your talk. Here's, again, this slide that I made with the packages. The link at the bottom by Bateman et al. Has some really nice examples to refer you to. So they're a trade-off, using sparingly. Next, I've been talking about the visual channel effect. Let's talk briefly about the auditory channel effect. The idea here is, again, visual and audio encoding happen in different parts of the brain. And it turns out that if you're trying to encode emotion occurs much more efficiently if you have no visual stimuli at all. So suppose the purpose of your talk is not to dump a bunch of facts on your audience, but instead a call to action, or maybe you're trying to persuade them of the rightness of your course. In case it might be better to just a black slide during this part of your talk. If I wanted to say, for the love of all that is merciful, please fill out your CME forms at the end of this presentation. Hopefully the audience will detect the honest emotion in my voice and react accordingly. Finally, I'd like to talk about the interactions between these 2 types of channels. There are a bunch of them, and notice the bullet points here. Every one of them mentions the word overload. I'm going to concentrate on one, visual channel. Remember the serial position curve? Well, this effect I'm about to talk about, this is why I put it last, because I really, 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 really want you to remember this one. Okay, dual channel learning. Remember, you see stuff through your eyes, you see stuff through your ears. So what's the optimal combination of these 2 things to ensure optimal information transfer? Turns out, the ideal way is if each channel gets something slightly different but complementary. For example, your eye sees this. Your ear sees someone telling a story about this image up here. That is the best. If that sounds like radiology lectures you've given, then you're awesome. Keep up that pathway. You're doing the right thing. On the other hand, you've probably all seen examples of people doing the absolute worst, where both channels get exactly the same information. Your eye sees this. Your ear hears someone reading the freaking slide. Why would you want to do that to your audience? This slide would link you to an article where they talk about the inattentional deafness that can happen, where if you're measuring the stimuli coming into the auditory cortex under high visual overload, people actually get a little bit literally and cannot actually hear as well. Why would you voluntarily do that to your audience? If this is the kind of presentation you've been giving, consider changing it to this kind of presentation. Show images, tell stories about them. So let me summarize here. I've talked about a number of different things, hopefully leaving all opinions on the table and having just facts, evidence. Talk about cognitive biases such as the serial position curve. I really want you to remember the first thing and the last thing in my presentation. Visual channel effects. Picture superiority, which means radiology presentation should be superior to anything that doesn't have pictures in them. Keep an eye on your colors, and Color Oracle will help you make sure all of your color combinations are safe for all audiences. Use redundant encoding of information. Occasionally exploit the auditory channel effect if you're really trying to persuade someone that this is the best way to give a talk. Also strongly consider the interactions between visual and auditory channels. Again, to hammer this point home yet another time, this is the worst way where you read your slides. The best way is to tell a picture about each. If you'd like to read more details about this, here's our presentation. And thus endeth the gospel on presentation lore. So, do you believe? Can I have an amen? Thank you, brothers and sisters.